This is one of those Bible verses that leads to the everything else was inferior and Jesus was the beginning of everything, understanding. So it's really important to grasp this one from the right end. It's pretty hard not to read it that way. There was Moses and the law, but then truth and grace was brought by Jesus Christ. Part of it has to be understood that when John was writing, because this is from the Gospel of John, it was still in the context when Moses was the avatar to the Jews. Because of all the divisions that have taken place between Jews and Christians in all the intervening centuries, that simple fact is very often lost. In fact, in a book I was reading just recently, a American Jewish man was talking about just the different experience of being a minority and how hard it was in his elementary school. He said every Christmas pageant that everyone else would sing these beautiful Christmas carols, and then the 3 or 4 Jewish kids would have to stand on the stage and sing, "I have a little dreidel, I made it out of clay," which is just a terrible song. There's many other songs that are better. And then they would sit down again, and it just was mortifying. And then he talked about how one boy he came home to his mother and he said, we're having a Christmas pageant and they cast me in the part of Jesus. This was a little Jewish boy. And his mother was quite disturbed and went back to the teacher. And the teacher was bewildered. She said, well, Jesus was a Jew. Seemed like the right part for him. You're not quite following all the twists and turns of the intervening centuries. But it was the power. What we have to understand is that the avatar doesn't just sort of randomly just think, I like the weather in Hawaii, I think I'll incarnate there, I have a friend in Germany, I think I'll go incarnate in Germany. There's a divine power that's created by the sincere longing of the devotees. In the ritual of the Festival of Light, we say that. A prayer of love went up from earth and you responded. It's a very important phrase in there. A ray of your light burst out from the heart of infinity, burst downward through night skies of consciousness, and was born on earth for the redemption of mankind in human form. But a prayer of love went up from earth and you responded. So there has to be some fertile ground before an avatar will step in. Because we have to understand that this is not, when a master comes with a revelation of how we souls can draw closer to our infinite self, there has to be receptive soil. It isn't a matter of the avatar coming and telling you that you must convert. In fact, one of the ways that you can tell whether truth is deeply rooted or only superficial is by how forcefully people try to persuade you that it's true. I've observed something in Swami Kriyananda, it's taken me years to sort of understand this, that on some occasions, he can be extraordinarily impressive, tremendous flow of magnetism, a brilliant conversationalist, just marvelous in his explanations of the philosophy. At other times, he's just an utterly dull dinner companion, just nothing comes from him, in groups of people. But of course, the difference is whether the individuals present are drawing from him, because there's nothing in him. For those of you who are brand new, he's the founder of our community and the source of everything that you see here in his magnetism. But if there's a power that is genuinely interested and capable of receiving, then the energy automatically flows. It's not even a decision. It's just the window is open and the energy will come in. If individuals are either indifferent or even more so challenging, but challenging with that kind of challenge that doesn't say, how can this be true? Help me to understand how it's true, but says, how can this be true? You can see the entire difference. And there's many people, even spiritual teachers, who rise to that challenge and like the argument and will try to best you and persuade you. But there's a quality of self-realization that's simply too delicate for that. Because you can't really persuade someone of this teaching. You can present it to them, and if it resonates with their own state of consciousness, they'll hear it. And if it doesn't, it just goes completely by them. So when the avatar even comes, when the master even descends, there has to be a powerful vortex somewhere of a group of some kind, whether it's a culture or a specific small group, whatever it is, that is ready to hear it. And at the time that Jesus incarnated, it was in the depths of Kali Yuga descending. It was the dark material age getting worse. It wasn't until 500 years after Jesus died that the lowest point of that dark age was reached, and we sort of began to inch up the other side. So things were bad and getting worse. And so there was the mass consciousness was not elevated. Nowadays, between science and religion, there's a tremendous force that makes the teaching of self-realization almost common knowledge. As I joke about it now, especially on the west coast of California, either people meditate or they feel guilty because they don't, which is, a lot of progress, because, a number of years ago, people didn't even know what it was, except maybe to meditate on your problems, which is to just sit around and worry about them. But now everybody knows what it's about. Yoga is very common just everywhere you go, because the whole consciousness of the planet has arisen. At the time that Jesus was there, if you did something wrong, you were crucified on the public highway. I mean, just imagine going down El Camino and seeing people being crucified. I mean, you literally can't imagine it. But at the time that Jesus lived, he was crucified in a public place with several others who were just thieves. So it was a very, very low. But the Jews, because Judaism is a true religion and Moses was a great avatar, the Jews were a remnant of a much deeper understanding. And because of the Mosaic law and their determination to conform to it, which by that point had become a bit corrupted, but nonetheless there was still a true kernel there from a higher age. Visualize the age getting darker and darker. See, what we're living with is the age getting brighter and brighter. So as time passes in the span of my own lifetime, I've watched, meditation and yoga as a good example, which was very, very fringy, sort of moving into the center of society because people are getting wiser and wiser. States still have the death penalty, for example, but there's a huge movement against it. And even, a movement against executing a murderer in a way that's cruel, which is, on one hand, a bit confusing, but what it's indicative of is just a higher and higher level of consciousness. Far from crucifying people on the roadside, we don't think even the worst criminals should be killed, which is progress. Better to give them a chance to reform. But in Kali Yuga descending, what little bit of wisdom there was becoming more and more obscure. Now bear in mind, this is a planetary cycle of awareness. The drama of soul evolution takes place that's the backdrop. What's going on in the planet does not cause our individual evolution. It's merely the context in which we have to act it out. And some ages are much more refined, and so many more refined souls will come to this planet. Also, Master said, don't think that you can just sort of cling to the planet while it rises and you'll evolve with it, because when your body dies, if Earth is too refined for you, you'll just find another planet that's more on your level. Because, as Master said, this universe is teeming with life. It's really touchingly arrogant to imagine that we're the only inhabited planet out here. It's just simply not so. At least Master declared it wasn't. But in any case, so there they were. The Jewish people and all of society had been much more elevated. This is the secret of things like the pyramids and other artifacts that no one can explain, because they're just too refined. I mean, really, I really don't think even 100,000 Jews could have put those pyramids together, as the poor slaves of the Egyptians. Nobody knows how they were built. They say now that they were built by the power of sound, by the manifesting power of light, by things that we're just beginning to learn. When we finally get evolved enough, we'll suddenly understand what they were doing. But in any case, the Jews remembered and held to this high teaching. And there were high souls among the Jews, obviously, because there were 12 apostles among many others. And then they were surrounded by a more and more gross society. We're sort of a little bit in that position ourselves right now, aren't we? The society as a whole, even though parts are elevating, it's also sinking at a really impressive rate. And so our own soul awakening is being acted out against a background that is not entirely supportive. And if there's more wars and things like that, it'll become even less supportive. But the Jews knew, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." That was a prayer that Jesus confirmed also. It's such an exquisite, simple prayer. There is only one reality. That's all. There's only one truth. I don't mean one religion, I mean a single reality. That's the essence of self-realization. But at the time when an avatar descends, that avatar has unlimited free consciousness. But as soon as he takes human form, he becomes limited not only by the force of a human body, but he becomes limited by the culture into which he is incarnated and by the capacity of his disciples to understand. And so he has to teach in keeping with what that reality is. Of course, he can take aside a few and give them everything. But overall, Jesus couldn't even speak directly of self-realization, of Kriya Yoga, of things he taught his disciples. In the Bible it says from time to time, and he took his disciples aside, and he took a few aside and he spoke to them, but the Bible doesn't report what he said to them because his public message had to be scaled to what was happening. Now, the Jewish people formed by Moses, the whole story of Moses is the burning bush and the 10 Commandments, isn't it? It was God declaring that this is how you must behave. Because at the time that Moses descended, the Jews had been slaves. They had been enslaved in Egypt. Moses came to free them, again, because the prayer of love went up from earth, and God responded and sent them Moses, and he took them out of that enslavement. But people who have been enslaved don't have really the capacity to understand how to live on their own. It's very interesting in more modern times, right after the Civil War, right after the slaves were freed in the South especially, they were just wandering around, not really knowing how to take care of themselves at all because they'd never had to. And he wasn't an avatar, but he was a very great saint, George Washington Carver. If you ever have a chance to read any of his books, we think of him as the inventor of peanut butter because he was a very great scientist. But what he really was, he was a divine messenger to the black people in the South. And he lived in that place, and all his scientific efforts were to create agricultural crops that would grow in the South that would give the black people a way to begin to be self-sustaining. And then he helped with the man who incarnated at the same time, and they made Tuskegee University. And it's a really moving story to see how God came to help those people establish themselves. Well, interestingly, in a way we can't document quite as clearly, that's what Moses' role was. But Moses was an avatar, and the Jewish people had a more profound role to play at that time. But they had to just understand how to behave. Now, this is all history. This is religious history. This is the evolution of history. It's also the story of the individual soul's evolution. Because we find ourselves, the soul doesn't evolve, but the realization, the evolution of realization. So we find ourselves just sort of wandering around, not really knowing how to take care of ourselves or irrationally dependent on the thoughts of others. We're like enslaved to a reality that is not really our own. And then we begin to rise with some strength. And we want to be more free. We want to be more self-determined. But we're not really sure where to find happiness. This is what you see in adolescence. I don't want to be dependent on you anymore, so I'm going to go out and make a lot of really stupid decisions, but I'm going to make them myself. And if the parent is wise, he won't entirely thwart that. Because that's the child's first step to try to understand how to be on my own. But hopefully, the child will come under good influences and grow into a man or a woman who understands the parameters of right behavior, not just as dogma, but from the inside, because this is how I should be. So Moses, with the power given to him by God, declared for the Jewish people, this is how you should behave. And there was mystical implications to many things. Thou shalt have no other gods before me is not really that you can't put up any pictures of anyone, which is how the Jews have determined it now, it means that you shall not put the ego before the divine. God, meaning that which you worship, you should not worship self, you should worship the infinite. Of course, you can have pictures that remind you of God reminding things. This is how everything gets corrupted. You're not really thinking that the picture on the altar is actually the source of power, that that piece of paper is what inspires us. But of course, it reminds us. But we don't put a picture of ourselves on our altar and worship that unless we see the divine within ourselves perfectly. The details get confused, but I won't go there. But so it is with us, that the first thing we have to understand is what the divine laws are. And this is a hugely important step in spiritual progress, to get to the point where we realize, but it's not really a question of whether I like it or not. It isn't a question of my opinion. This is just simply the way it is. This is how you start educating children. You say to your little child, the stove is hot. Feel, the stove is hot. The child wants to touch the stove. The mother says the stove is hot. Sometimes you just let the child put his hand on the stove, once at least. Or you might put his finger on the stove so the child says, oh, the stove is hot. I understand that. It's not just because mommy says I can't touch it. It's because it's a really bad idea to touch the hot stove. So God gave, through Moses to the Jews, these laws of behavior. Not as dogmas, but so that they could practice through that structure to experience for themselves the truth of what life is about. But of course, to only behave right out of a sense of punishment, I better not do that because something bad's going to happen to me, but I really wish I could have the bad thing, I could have the thing I want without having the bad happen to me. That's a beginning. And we start with our relationship with God often out of fear, don't we? And that was a really big motivating factor for, many, many centuries of religious life through Kali Yuga, which is, you would go to hell. It kept people in line. I mean, eternal damnation in those infernos, they were really unpleasant. If you ever see like Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, and you see all these writhing bodies, and these demonic people torturing them, and God being so vengeful, I mean, that's scary. And you read about saints who were influenced by that way of thinking, and when you enter into it from their point of view, it's easy from our point of view just to dismiss it. But it was a powerful thought form, that if I stray from the straight and narrow, I will experience an eternity of suffering. I mean, that's really a few moments of pleasure, an eternity of suffering. You might still slip, but it makes a person think a bit, You can't just disregard it. But still, of course, there's more to the divine life than that. And what happens to us if we first just obey law, even out of fear? Gradually, what happens to us is that our own consciousness begins to teach us. And we begin to discover, for example, the sheer joy of giving, the joy of living honorably, the pleasure of having a clear conscience, and knowing that no harm has been caused by my own actions. People who harm others out of selfishness may put a facade over it, but we are one with the whole universe. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest of all the commandments? He said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy mind, with all thy soul, and with all thy strength. He said, that's the first commandment. And the second commandment is like unto the first, that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, Master says it's not thou shalt love thy neighbor because thy neighbor is thyself. You see, it's a very deep teaching. The Buddha said once, the reason we feel close to people is that because sometime or another we have been close to every being that we meet, every being on the planet with us, we have been close to, implying in a personal way. You don't even know where to take that with your mind. But the fact is, when you suffer, I suffer, because we are the same. Ramakrishna wanted to teach one of his disciples the interrelationship of all life once, and that disciple had been brutal to a cat, because the cat was invading the kitchen. He just kicked him and moved him aside. And then he came to Ramakrishna. He was a great saint of the 1800s. And Ramakrishna was all bruised. And the disciple said, "Master, who did this to you? Let me see who he is and I will give him the appropriate punishment." And Ramakrishna said, "You did." "Sir." "Well," he said, "when you kicked the cat, you were kicking me." And he was literally bruised where the cat had been kicked. Just trying to get the disciple to understand in a very dramatic way. That's what Jesus was trying to say. Now this is what our reading is about, where Swamiji draws these differences. Kindness is the external expression, but the real expression, you see, is the experience of oneness. Justice is the external expression, but the real experience is the inward truth of our divine relationships. So we can start, and we need to start somewhere, with getting all of these systems in order. And we can't, as some people love to do, just try to skip lots of stages. Well, it's all one anyway, so what difference does it make how I behave? It's just like spirituality is just a great justification for self. You can really just take these teachings and twist them all around if the I involved is ego and its desires. But the deeper reality we're looking for, and this is what Krishna is talking about later on in the Gita, is the grace that descends, the inner reality. Moses taught you the law, and especially what John was saying is the priests are now teaching you the law. Because again, the cultural context of it was that now, at the time that Jesus lived, the priests had taken those laws and multiplied them a zillion-fold and put the deciding power in their hands. And so the whole of Judaism, or I should say the public face of Judaism at that time, had just descended to this priesthood controlling the people and dictating to them all the things that they needed to do. And Jesus talks about how the priests are so ostentatious in the way they give, and it's all external. And more than that, it's all about their ego aggrandizement. And from the very beginning, Jesus was in this incredible war with this priesthood. He wasn't at war with Judaism, because Judaism, as it was taught by Moses, was exactly what Jesus was teaching. But he was at war with the priesthood. He was at war with what it had become. And what he brought was, it's not about the law, it's about love. You're a child of God. And as a child of God, love God, and his grace will descend. You will discover the truth of your true nature, which is not all these laws and rules. It's who you really are. But you see, once the people are given the power to experience that grace and truth within themselves, what do you need of the priesthood anymore? And the priests were not stupid. They didn't get to that position by being dumb. And they saw profoundly that if this heresy were allowed to go on, then their days were finished. And so they took appropriate action. They just got rid of him. And they claimed that he was heretical. They claimed that he was blaspheming, because he was claiming that an individual person, by the grace of God, could discover the truth of his own being. And he broke the laws. He healed on the Sabbath. You're not supposed to do anything on the Sabbath. That's one of the rules. And Jesus healed on the Sabbath. And that's where Jesus replied, but this the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Which is to say, the laws were made to help us. It's not like the law comes first and then we have to make ourselves go into that. It's the opposite. But you see, this demands a level of personal responsibility and a subtlety of inner understanding, and it could only be offered at the point when at least a few had evolved to that point. Now, in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is not talking about religious history at all. I should just add one more point, which is very interesting. Paramhansa Yogananda came at the bequest of Jesus, at the behest of Jesus. He came to re-inspire the true teaching of Christianity. But now you see we've gone past the bottom of Kali Yuga and we're up on the other side. So Yogananda can talk even much more explicitly. And he's taking even, some of the dogmas that have become Christianity, and he's just moving them aside. And he's talking, this would be the evolution, Moses talked about God as a fair and honorable judge, basically. Jesus was able to talk about God the Father, still wisdom-oriented, but loving and your own. Yogananda talks about the mother. You see, it gets more and more intimate. It moves farther and farther away from externals and becomes more and more, what is more intimate than the relationship with the mother? Literally, we come out of the mother's body. The mother carries us and makes her from herself. And then we are born from her body and we are nurtured at her breast. There is no relationship more intimate than the relationship with the mother. And Master presents that not to elevate women per se, but to bring us into an understanding of how very, very close that relationship is. And then he even teaches, with the father, you have to meet the demands of the law, but the mother can just dissolve everything. Isn't it so with little children? They learn that very fast. And if the parents are not really together on this, the kids can really work the system, can't they? Daddy, can I do it? No, dear, you haven't met the criteria. Mommy, I want it. All right, honey. Because that's how the mother's heart goes. Of course, the true divine mother is also wise. But that's how we think of it. And Master even talks about that. And he has these charming prayers where the devotee as a little child crawls on the mother's lap and says, I know I've done wrong things and I should have the karmic retribution for what I've done, but I know you can just make it right, can't you, Mother? Just so sweet. Because that really is how we're meant to be. And I was wanting to say, now in Krishna's talking about it, he's not talking about religious evolution, but he's talking about the devotee. And he talks about all the principles of yoga and all the practices that you can do and all the yagyas and all the ceremonies that you can do. And he teaches Arjuna for 17 and a half chapters of the Gita, all these ways in which you can be a righteous man. And then at the very end of the Gita, he says, but really, in actual fact, all of that doesn't matter. Because the reason that we follow all those rites and rituals and things that we do is because it disciplines our wayward consciousness. And don't misunderstand me. Your twice-a-day practice of Kriya, your doing of the energization exercises, every other technique that we have learned and principle that we have learned is absolutely essential, because otherwise our minds run wild. And we don't think about God, we think about nothing at all. It just goes in every direction. And it's not as if those techniques actually liberate us, but they make us able, as I was talking last week about attunement, they make us able to experience the grace. And then the grace, the experience of superconsciousness, the direct and actual perception, I don't have to try to love people. I just love them because that's who I am. I might have been trying my whole life to be kind, but all of a sudden when I perceive myself and others as they are, it's that love is deeper than the kindness. And then the kindness is no longer necessary as a rule because nothing else is possible. So, and I will close by reading again what Gregory read so well. Krishna's last words. Nay, but once more, take my last word, my utmost meaning have. Precious thou art to me, right well beloved. Listen, I tell thee for thy comfort this, give me thy heart. Adore me, serve me, cling in faith and love and reverence to me. So shalt thou come to me, I promise true, for thou art sweet to me. And let go those rites and writ duties, fly to me alone. Make me thy single refuge. I will free thy soul from all its sins. Be of good cheer. God bless you.